Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, I can say hello to everybody. Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Kirk Lecture, which is sponsored annually by the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Denver. My name is Sandra Dixon. I'm on the faculty in the department, and I'm the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. I also wear another hat that I'll mention because I see some of my pals from that program here. I also direct the joint PhD program in the study of religion. Yeah, they're cheering in the back. In the study of religion of DU and ILIF. So just to let you know, we're a very lively campus in terms of religious studies, and also there are various vibrant religious communities around here. We have been inviting fascinating speakers for this event every year since 1998. Way back when, we didn't have a Zoom link, as I believe we have this time, but COVID brought us into that fold, so there will be people joining us online. Before I turn over the floor for the introduction of the speaker, I would like to thank some people. First, Elizabeth Oliver and Ethan Dvorak, who works with Elizabeth on the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences Marketing and Communications team. Clearly, they also know what they're doing when they're planning events. I want to thank my faculty colleague, Christy Cobb, who by day is a specialist in New Testament and early Christianity, and in her vanishingly thin free time is a guiding light for planning lecture events. Is Amelia here? Where? Well, I'm going to mention Amelia anyway, because Amelia, our student employee, helps keep the department moving with a smile. And she put up events for flyers for this event before it occurred to me that she might have done it. So I was going over and asking her, now what about those flyers? And she said, they're up. I'm like, right, sorry. Okay, finally, I want to mention other colleagues in religious studies, three of whom I believe are joining us by Zoom. One is Jason Jeffries in African American Religions and Critical Theory, Carl Raschke in Philosophy of Religion, and Allison Schofield in Hebrew Bible and Judaic Studies. Part of the reason I'm mentioning the faculty are we established this lecture in honor of James Kirk, not the fictional one, and he did a whole lot to build up the department, so we've kind of given the department just a couple of minutes of publicity at each lecture. I also want to mention, now I wrote it down so I didn't end up leaving anybody out by mistake, so let me try here. Ben Noorse in Buddhist Studies, you want to wave, stand up, cheer. Andrea Stanton in Islamic Studies, who is also often found in the Dean's Office serving as Senior Associate Dean, and Deepa Sundaram in Hindu Studies. Okay, great, thank you. Now, I am proud to introduce Evelyn Stoven, a graduating senior in the Department of Religious Studies. Soon, they will be on their way to study for their master's degree at Duke Divinity School. For this evening, she will stay with us and introduce our speaker. Evelyn?
Good evening, everyone. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Sorry, I'm tall. Good evening, everyone. My name is Evelyn. I am a fourth-year undergraduate in religious studies and minors in Judaic studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and mathematics, and it is an honor to be with you all today. I am honored to introduce to you Dr. Shayna Sheinfeld, this year's Kirk Lecturer. Dr. Sheinfeld is an assistant professor of religion at Augsburg University, where she teaches courses on Judaism, the Bible, and how they relate to sex and gender. Dr. Sheinfeld has published extensively on these topics, including a recent co-edited volume titled Constructions of Gender in Religious Traditions of Late Antiquity, another titled Gender and Second Temple Judaism. She also co-authored an award-winning textbook titled Jewish and Christian Women in the Ancient Mediterranean, which you can actually purchase here tonight if you are interested. I think it's back there at the table. Yeah. In addition to this impressive body of scholarship, Dr. Sheinfeld is interested in the afterlives of the Bible, especially within popular culture. In this area, she has co-edited a book called Good Omens and the Bible, A Woman After My Own Heart, oh my God, as well as one titled Theology and Westworld. She has also published a number of articles, including one on monotheism and polytheism in the TV show Battlestar Galactica, and another on Katniss from the young adult novels The Hunger Games, which discusses issues of sacrifice and salvation in the Bible. Tonight's lecture is titled Defiance and Power, Gendered Resistance in First Century Judea. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shayna Sheinfeld in the University of Denver.
Good evening. Thank you, Evelyn, for the lovely introduction. A special shout out to Dr. Christy Cobb for the invitation and hospitality, and to Dorian Weissman for arranging many of the details of my visit. Thank you too to Sandra Dixon, Chair of Religious Studies of the Religious Studies Department, and Rachel Walsh, Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. I am very grateful to be here at the University of Denver today. Just over a month ago, on April 5th, more than 1,300 hands-off rallies were held across the country, protesting how the current federal government had been undermining democratic systems in the US, from eliminating necessary jobs and research funding, to deporting people, to rolling back civil rights, to racist anti-immigration policies, and so much more. Adding to that, we've seen many protests, even in the last 5 years, just within the United States. Rallies against police brutality, Black Lives Matter protest, Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipelines, just to name a few. Protests are just one form of resistance. A quick internet search, I did this just the other day, a quick internet search will yield many different approaches to how one might resist tyranny or injustice, from rallies to calling our senators and representatives, to volunteering, to donating. The availability of advice on this topic is, needless to say, overwhelming. Interestingly, a side note, when I Googled the question, how to resist tyranny in the US, the AI overview that appears at the top of the search was suspiciously not available. Some guidance I consistently see begins with 2 points. First, choose to act in a way that is right for you. Different people have different privilege and abilities, and it makes sense that resisting looks different for each of us. For example, if you have access to money or high-ranking officials, you might enact your resistance through lobbying. A person without that kind of access may decide to protest at rallies. Someone who is chronically ill may call their representatives. Second, there's often so much that one can choose to protest or could choose to do that, as I mentioned, it can be overwhelming. Anybody else feel this ever? There's so much I want to protest that I often am just like frozen. So hence my looking into this topic to begin with. So the research says, pick a few things that are most important to you and accessible to you and focus on them. Trust that other people will pick those other things that you also care about, and that those people will focus on those. And so everything will be covered. But what has been especially interesting to me is how discussions of resistance today relate to what resistance looks like in antiquity. Many of the ancient literary sources focus on resistance through physical means, that is, taking up arms and fighting in battles. At other times, it is purely political, maneuvering, alliances, flattery, rhetoric, and other political intrigue. These ancient sources are written by and for men, so their protagonists, including the villains, are nearly always men. Since my own research is focused on minoritized and erased voices from the ancient world, it takes a special kind of analysis to lift up those voices and hear the stories they have to tell. While the modes of resistance these voices take may also include physical violence, they take other forms and are sometimes so decentered in the narratives that it is easy to miss them entirely. Today, I'd like to focus on 3 of these narratives that come from the Jewish revolt against Rome, which happened from 66 to 72 CE. Within these stories, you will see how resistors follow the advice that we still get today about how to resist. So let's turn to the geopolitical situation in the first century. Judea and its surrounding areas were marked by pockets of discontent with Roman imperial rule. People were resentful towards poor leadership from Roman-appointed officials. They were unhappy with upper-class Jews who benefited from collaboration with Roman authorities. There was regular threat of violation and actual violation of Jewish law. Taxes were unfairly high, and they funded violent Roman expansion and egregious excesses of the elite. There was constant food insecurity and brutal capital punishments. All of these things and more affected the lower classes acutely. It is clear from a variety of sources that this situation created an atmosphere where many Jews hoped to be freed from Roman rule. At this time, too, the memory of Jewish political sovereignty was still fresh in some people's minds, especially as the Herodian client monarchs ruled in Judea. The decades between the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE to the revolt in 66 CE saw repeated protests, which often turned into riots, followed by violent suppression by the Roman authority. It was within this politically charged environment that Jews rebelled against the Romans. Like with many revolts, rebel opinions were divided about just how violent the revolt should be. And our ancient sources report a lot of infighting among Jewish factions, as well as about individual Jews who continued to collaborate with the Romans throughout the revolt. This is not a vision of cohesion and agreement, but of different rebel leaders jockeying for power and position and promoting their vision of what the rebellion should be. Rabbinic thinkers on the revolt say that it was intra-religious conflict, that is, conflict between Jews, that actually led to the revolt's failure and to the destruction of the Second Temple. And like with all wars, the causes and results are complex. Today, I will share 3 stories of resistance in roughly chronological order, starting with Queen Berenike, just as the revolt was breaking out, shifting toward the middle of the revolt with the Zealots, and finally ending with one of the last holdouts at the very end of the revolt. While each of these examples include Jews from Roman antiquity, they also highlight various ways that resistance might appear based on an individual's situation, status, and identity. A brief word about the main historical source for this information. All 3 of these stories come from the 1st century Roman Jewish historian Josephus, who is the primary historical source about the Jewish revolt against Rome. Josephus himself participated in the revolt and was captured in 67, but quickly put his elite status, education, and diplomacy to work, and ended up serving as a negotiator between Romans and Jews during the revolt, so that he was privy to a lot of information. That being said, following the destruction of the Second Temple, Josephus was granted Roman citizenship and worked under the patronage of the emperor when he wrote all his known works. So while he was Jewish and fought against Rome, his work was also sponsored by Rome. In other words, the Roman emperors paid his bills. Josephus's works are not without bias. Okay, on to our first story. Born around 28 CE, Julia Berenike, sometimes called Berenike II or Queen Berenike, was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. In her early teens, she was married to the nephew of Philo of Alexandria, another well-known first-century Jewish writer. After her first husband's death, she was married to her uncle, who was king of Chalcis. This was pretty common back then, especially among the Herodian family. This marriage, though, gave her the title of queen. Her second husband died when she was only 20, leaving her with their 2 sons. Berenike's brother, Agrippa II, was appointed king in place of their uncle, and the 2 siblings acted as co-regents, appearing together in official capacity. A few years later, Berenike was married once again, this time to the king of Cilicia. Josephus reports that this marriage happened in order to squelch rumors of incestuous relations between her and her brother. When this marriage ended a short time later, Berenike returned to rule beside her brother. While Agrippa II and Berenike were both the active rulers at the time of the outbreak of the first revolt, my focus here will be on the queen, and especially her act of resistance in an episode leading up to the outbreak of the Jewish revolt against Rome. So, first, you have to have some backstory. The Roman governor in charge of Judea at this time was Gessius Florus. I'll call him Florus for the rest of this, okay? So he's our antagonist, and he was antagonistic towards the Jewish population. So in this story, Florus had encouraged a bribe from the Jews in the town of Caesarea in order to keep certain non-Jewish locals from disturbing prayer in the synagogue. So locals would come and disrupt while the Jews of this town were trying to pray. So the Jews paid the bribe, but then rather than doing what he said he would do, Florus left for the countryside, allowing for these same locals to offer sacrifices in front of the synagogue, thereby rendering the building space unusable for Jews. When members of the Jewish population reached out to discuss the matter with Florus, he had them imprisoned. So this incident then led to unrest in the city of Jerusalem, where Jews there protested the unfair treatment of those arrested in Caesarea. Everybody with me so far? Okay, good. Rather than seeking to diffuse the situation, it sounds like it could be like a soap opera or something, right? Yeah. Rather than seeking to diffuse the situation, Florus then took 17 talents of silver from the Jerusalem temple treasury. So Josephus reports that the Jewish community in Jerusalem organized peaceful protests against the arrest of these Jews in Caesarea and against Florus's stealing money from the temple treasury. However, a few Jewish Jerusalemites, I cannot say that. You would think I would choose words that I could say out loud, right? A few Jewish citizens of the city of Jerusalem thought a better way to protest Florus's stealing the money was not to come out en masse in peaceful protest, but instead, I guess with some chutzpah, to take up baskets and go around collecting alms for Florus as if he were poor, in mocking him, right? So he was enraged. He ordered his soldiers to destroy the upper market near the temple, and anyone found was to be captured and brought before him for scourging and crucifixion. In other words, they were to be killed for protesting the abuse of power. Josephus, probably exaggerating the number, reports that some 3,600 people were killed. So it's at this time now that we're going to turn back to Queen Berenike. So her brother, King Agrippa, was away at the time visiting a political ally in Alexandria, Egypt. However, Berenike just so happened to be in Jerusalem making pilgrimage to the temple when the unrest in Jerusalem broke out. Josephus writes, I'll read this as well. I know it's a lot of words on the screen, so I'm going to read it. His sister Berenike, who was at Jerusalem, witnessed with the liveliest emotion the outrages of the Roman soldiers, and constantly sent her cavalry commanders and bodyguards to Florus to implore him to put a stop to the carnage. But he, regarding neither the number of the slain nor the exalted rank of his suppliant, but only the profit accruing from the plunder, turned a deaf ear to her prayers. The mad rage of the soldiers even vented itself upon the queen. Not only did they torture and put their captives to death under her eyes, but they would have killed her also had she not hastened to seek refuge in the palace, where she passed the night surrounded by guards, dreading an attack of the troops. She was in Jerusalem to discharge a vow to God, for it is customary for those suffering from illness or other affliction to make a vow to abstain from wine and to shave their heads during the 30 days preceding that on which they must offer sacrifices. These rites Berenike was then undergoing, and she would come barefoot before the tribunal and make supplication to Florus, without any respect being shown to her, and even at the peril of her own life. So Berenike finds herself in Jerusalem completing a Nazirite vow. By taking this vow, which was likely done for some personal reason, Berenike had abased herself, cutting her hair, wearing simple clothes, abstaining from wine, and the period leading up to the sacrifices that she was going to offer at the temple. It is in the midst of this pilgrimage of hers when the riots take place. While in the process of this ritual, Berenike appears before Florus, already humbled in appearance, to ask him to put a stop to the violence before she herself is chased down by Roman soldiers. She's only able to get away unharmed because of her guards. Her placement in Jerusalem as a Nazarite is not to be glossed over. While she is Herodian and therefore part of the elite class, which was appointed by and worked with Rome to rule Judea, her presence in Jerusalem and her ritual actions highlight her self-identification as a Jew and her commitment to Judaism and the Jewish community. That she chooses to present herself before Florus while she's in the midst of a highly visible cultic act highlights her choice to stand alongside and protest with her fellow Jews, rather than to identify only as an elite who can opt out of being affected by the unrest, or to wait for her brother, the king, to return to address the situation. Instead, Berenike not only acts as witness to the events, but places herself in them, presenting herself before Florus and asking for the end of violence against her people. While Berenike is not successful in convincing Florus to stop, she does not let the affair rest. After the incident, she petitions Roman authorities to investigate the situation. She makes public appearances to help support the calls for a peaceful resolution and actively works to prevent outright revolt. She appears several times when her brother is trying to assuage the anger and hostility from the Jewish populace toward Rome. She was not, unfortunately, successful in petitioning to Rome to stop the unnecessary and excessive violence against the Jews in Jerusalem and throughout Judea, nor were she and her brother able to persuade the Jewish population that it wasn't Rome as a whole, but only a few corrupt leaders who were the problem. The Roman authorities continued to push while the Jewish population became more fed up with the situation until their reactions finally tilted into full-scale revolt in 66 CE. It would be easy to overlook Berenike as a figure of resistance. Despite the narrative I have focused on in this talk, the ancient sources, Josephus and some other Roman historians, for Berenike overwhelmingly portray her negatively. As with most of the Herodian women in Josephus, her portrayals are over-sexualized and her ambitions are presented as unwomanly. Her reputation is also overshadowed by rumors of incest with her brother and by disapproval for her love affair with a Roman general and future Flavian emperor Titus. Scholars who fall for this slut-shaming rhetoric miss her significant role in resistance leadership. So looking back at the advice for resisting, we can see that Berenike follows the two rules of resistance that I started with. First, she is choosing to act in a way that is right for her. As a Jewish queen in her own right, and having elite status and power that comes within the Roman Imperium, Berenike uses her position and power to bodily step up and in front of Florus, who holds the power in the initial scenario, to petition for an end to the violence against her people. It is only when she herself is in danger that she physically retreats. But after the incident, she continues to use her position to petition the Roman authorities who could support change. Second, picking what is important to her. Berenike is not just concerned with the abuses of local Roman authorities. She also stepped in to try to persuade her own people that they should not revolt. Her goal is to put a stop to the fighting and to the end of Roman violence against her people. But to do that, she also has to convince the Jewish populace not to escalate the protests into outright rebellion. Our second story takes place toward the middle of the war before the sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Jewish temple. During this time, Jews were in active revolt, and the Romans were moving legions around to try to kill or capture and enslave resistors. Most of the major actors were men who were engaged in political intrigue or physical violence. There are rare reports of women engaging in fighting, such as in Josephus' book, The Jewish War, where he describes the capture and conquering of a town in the Galilee. In this town, when the Romans were finally able to make their way inside past the double walls that surrounded the town, they were met with fierce resistance. Josephus writes, "The able-bodied Jewish men fell upon the Romans in the narrow alleys, while from the houses the women pelted them with whatever missiles came to hand." You go, girl, right? Here, the women are said to be inside the houses, perhaps hiding, but still fighting when confronted with enemy soldiers. Likewise, the Roman historian Tacitus, who died in 120 CE, reported, "We've heard that the total number of the besieged of every age and both sexes were 600,000. There were arms for all who could use them, and the number ready to fight was larger than could have been anticipated from the total population. Both men and women showed the same determination, and if they were to be forced to change their home, they feared life more than death." Here again, we see women fighting alongside men, fighting for their own liberty. However, reports of women fighting are indeed rare. But even in our sources about fighting, gender is at times blurred. In our next example, we will meet some members of a group known as the Zealots. So the Zealots came into existence during the revolt, at the beginning of the revolt, and were known and named for the zeal with which they approached their cause of overthrowing Roman rule. However, they also thought that others were not resisting vigorously enough. You aren't trying hard enough, right? You have to fight harder. And Josephus reports that they often fought against other Jews as well as Romans in their efforts to secure their freedom from Rome. In fact, as we move into the next text, we should be cognizant of the fact that Josephus himself very clearly does not like the Zealots, as numerous scholars have argued, and that his reports of their resistance work reflect his dislike for them. So when we're going to see the excerpt from Josephus on this, you're going to see you can tell by his language that he doesn't like these folks. None of the named zealots were women, so we do not know if women engaged actively in the group. However, there is this one fascinating scene described in Josephus where some members of the group dress at times in drag and perform femininity. During that time, they also participated in acts of physical resistance. So Josephus writes, again, I'll read this. I'm just going to get a little drink of water first. You may have noticed Josephus is a little bit wordy. With an insatiable lust for loot, these particular zealots ransacked the houses of the wealthy Jews. The murder of men and the violation of women were their sport. They caroused on their spoils, with blood to wash them down, and from mere satiety unscrupulously indulged in effeminate practices, plaiting their hair and attiring themselves in women's apparel, drenching themselves with perfume and painting their eyelids to enhance their beauty. And not only did they imitate the dress, but also the passions of women, devising in their excess of lasciviousness unlawful pleasures and wallowing as in a brothel in the city, which they polluted from end to end with their foul deeds. Yet while they wore women's faces, their hands were murderous, and approaching them with mincing steps, they would suddenly become warriors, and whipping out their swords from underneath their dyed mantles, transfix whomsoever they met. In this very dramatic scene, Josephus describes some of the members of the Zealots, of whom he definitely disapproves, as braiding their hair like women, wearing women's clothes, putting on perfume, and putting on makeup to enhance their beauty. They not only dress as women, but according to Josephus, they also partook in sex like women. That is, in Roman terms, they were penetrated instead of being the penetrators. But while Josephus describes this with distaste, what really turns him off is how these zealots still act like men by undertaking acts of physical violence. This is the quote, "They would suddenly become warriors and whip out their swords from under their dyed mantles," is they would still carry weapons and fight, as Josephus seems to think is only appropriate for men. Is only appropriate for men, but they would do this while they were dressed as women. Unlike today, gender norms in antiquity weren't based so much on a gender binary or even a horizontal spectrum, but on what scholars have come to call the one gender model. That one ideal gender was male, but only a certain kind of man, the weir. The weir was a man who was brave and noble, honorable, strong, maintained self-control, and was powerful. Rather than a product of birth or biology, manhood was a product of behavior. Very few men attained weir status, let alone women or non-elite men, enslaved persons, and others. As you can see from Josephus's description of these zealots with their gender-bending behavior, their sexual appetites, and their seemingly insatiable lust for blood, according to him, they were neither women nor weir, but almost monstrous in their actions. Remember, however, that Josephus does not align with the zealots here or elsewhere in his writings. You could see this easily in the language he uses in the passage, phrases like unscrupulously indulging insatiable lust and murder of men in violation of women highlights his point of view. In fact, Jason von Ehrenkrug argues that Josephus portrays the zealots as gender deviant in order to tyrannize them, and through them, the zealots' leader, who was, as von Ehrenkrug put it, Josephus's arch nemesis during the war. So there's a lot of subtext happening here. In other words, the gender bending and the excessive violence that Josephus used to portray the zealots here is meant to turn us, the audience, against them. And so we should read this passage with a hermeneutic of suspicion. By decentering Josephus's own agenda and applying some contemporary gender theory, we can reconsider this particular group of zealots. While there doesn't seem to be any doubt that they fought, and perhaps fought against other Jews, could they be fighting those who were proven to have collaborated with the Romans? Well, I personally do not condone violence of any kind. Perhaps in their context, they were thought by some to be heroes, and Josephus, who, if you remember, could himself be called a collaborator once he was captured by the Romans, was attempting to paint their actions so over the top that no one would assume that he was in any way associated with them. Decentering Josephus's narrative may help highlight that this particular group of zealots were perhaps men who participated in resistance twice over, resisting gender and sexual conformity, and resisting the Romans and their collaborators. Or perhaps they were trans women who were able to perform their identity even in the midst of an uprising against their Roman oppressors. Resistance is happening here both through the fighting they do and through their performance of gender. Within the framework of decentering Josephus's view of the zealots and of honoring the gender fluidity happening in this passage, we apply their situation to the two rules of resisting. First, even in the midst of the revolt, these zealots resist expectations of gender identity. In this resistance, they are also able to further their own cause, using their perceived femininity to fool their enemies into thinking they're not dangerous, while still fighting against their Roman oppressors and others who might be collaborating. Second, the zealots are fighters. Unlike Berenike, they do not have the connections or power to participate in negotiations. While Josephus clearly despises these folks, that they are able to resist the Romans through gender nonconformity has parallels in contemporary resistance narratives as well. All right, our last example. How many people here have heard of Masada before? Oh yeah, okay. So you'll know some of this. After the capture and destruction of Jerusalem, including the Jewish temple, the Romans went about cleaning up any pockets of resistance left. One such place one such example was a group known as the Sicarii, who earlier in the war had captured Masada. They moved there along with their families and any others who supported their anti-Roman cause, and were one of the last groups of resistors left. So Masada, if you don't know, is a mountain fortress located on the top of a plateau above the Dead Sea. That's what's pictured in the slide up there. The fortress dates from the 1st century BCE and was fortified and expanded, including surrounding it with walls and towers, constructing storerooms, adding bathhouses, and building 2 elaborate palaces. Perhaps most important for this story, though, was the addition of 12 large cisterns, which were fed by floods from the nearby wadis and which provided water year-round to the inhabitants. In 73 CE, the Romans laid siege to Masada, building fortified camps and a siege ramp on the western side of the plateau, both of which you can still see the remains of today. I'll share you some slides here. The stairs you see in those pictures, those aren't ancient, those are modern. Probably you could have guessed that, but You can kind of see it. It's hard to tell, but that kind of like hump in the middle, a little bit to the left of your screen, that wasn't there before. So the Romans dumped gravel and stone to build it up. So it took a lot of people doing that work in order to build that up to try and get up to the top. And here is an image of the Roman camp. What's left of it, of course, it didn't look like that in antiquity. But you kind of see that rectangle shape. So that's one of the places where the Romans camped. And so if you're up on top of Masada, you can look down and see that. So as the Romans prepared to attack the trapped Jews, the leader of the Sicarii, Eleazar ben Yair, attempted to convince his male compatriots that rather than allowing themselves and their wives and children to be killed or enslaved by the Romans, it would be better that everyone die with dignity by their own hand. This speech that he made was convincing to the men, driven to desperation by the siege and thoughts of starvation or torture and enslavement. So they agreed to draw lots and kill the women and children before killing one another, with the last one standing committing suicide. The men apparently undertook the action almost immediately. When the Romans reached the top of Masada, they found the flaming ruins of the Sicarii supplies and not a soul alive. Josephus reports that the Romans were amazed at the Sicarii's nobility and resolve. For many interpreters, Eleazar ben Yair, the leader of this last-ditch defiance against Rome, is a pious hero who is able to resist Rome, if not in military might, then through unwavering commitment to Judaism. He took seriously the Sicarii motto, "No ruler but God," and when the capture of Masada was inevitable, he turned to his men to convince them that being enslaved by the Romans would constitute serving another besides God, and thus betraying the Sicarii pledge. Other interpreters find that his solution of murdering wives and children, and finally one another, is ethically problematic, and note that neither murder nor suicide are condoned in the Torah. Regardless of whether Eleazar is read as a model of piety and dedication to God, or as an extremist reckless with the lives of his fellow Jews, his speech and actions represent resistance against Roman rule, regardless of the cost. While the overwhelming interpretive focus is on Eleazar's resistance and the extreme outcome, this focus obscures some other resistance figures in the story that I would like to bring to your attention. You may be asking yourself, if everybody was dead, how the heck did the Romans know what happened? If you're not, you maybe should be asking yourself that question, right? Okay, so let me tell you about that. So when the Romans reached the top of Masada and found only flames, they called out to see if anyone was still alive. Josephus reports that 7 people had survived the massacre, 2 women who had taken 5 children and hidden in the subterranean aqueducts. Of these 2 women, one is described as old, and the other, a relative of Eleazar, is described as, quote, superior in wisdom and training to other women. It is the second of these 2 women who describes in detail to the Romans what happened on Masada, including what Eleazar had said and how the murder-suicide pact was carried out. These women are not named, and we know very little about them, beyond that they managed to escape being murdered by hiding themselves and the children. Rhetorically, Josephus uses these women as the means by which what happened at Masada is relayed to the Romans, hence my asking you that question, right? His construction of gender here is very careful. One woman he describes as elderly, and therefore supposedly beyond an age when her sexuality would be the primary focus of a presumably male audience or of the men in the Roman army. The other younger woman is said to be wise and to have that better training than most women. So there are reasons behind these descriptions. For example, just what training the wise woman had is unclear, but is likely meant to be the reason as to why the Romans could trust a woman's report on what Eleazar said and what happened. Both women are in charge of 5 children, placing the women in the normative gender role as caregiver, which suggests that they had no suspicious or ulterior motives beyond staying alive. And therefore, with all of these caveats, they can be believed. So I would like to propose a different or perhaps additional reading, which centers the story of these women. While we don't know what happened, when or why they hid, we do know that they did so under the duress of the Roman siege and the murder-suicide of the men. So let's take a moment to employ a hermeneutic of imagination. Scholars like Bernadette Bruton, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, Will Gaffney, Saidiya Hartman, Adele Reinhartz, and Meredith Warren have all in different ways shown that when evidence is sorely lacking, as it often is for the experience of ancient women, then imagination is part of the required interpretive strategy. Of course, we should recognize that all history is a creative and subjective enterprise, but an intentional hermeneutic of imagination is particularly illustrative where evidence is sparse, and particularly important with regards to marginalized people in the historical record. Warren observes that mainstream scholarship currently tolerates quite a lot of imagination when it comes to mainstream ideas of what counts as likely. That is, mainstream ideas focused on men and related to manly topics like job, type of residence, war, but not when it comes to imagining the active, engaged presence of women or other marginalized groups. So under siege, with dwindling resources and the threat of death, torture, sexual violence, or enslavement for them and all their loved ones, these women must have found themselves scared. I thought I was going to spill my water. So these women must have found themselves scared, as I imagine any of us would be. So let's imagine these women overhearing Eleazar's plan. They must have, if they could report on what he said. Perhaps they discussed his plan of their murder and the murder of the children. So they decided to act. Together, they decide that a different form of resistance must happen. Resistance not only against the Romans, but also against Eleazar's murder-suicide pact. They somehow managed to gather 5 children, perhaps relatives of theirs, or orphans from the war, perhaps needing to make the difficult decision to leave behind babies who can't be kept quiet, or perhaps just scooping up whatever children were nearest in a hurry, or attempting to save as many children as they can without raising the alarm. They must leave others too, friends of theirs. Maybe they spread the news to try and encourage others to resist, or perhaps they didn't or couldn't. Let's imagine them hiding before Eleazar has even finished his speech. So these women embody a different kind of resistance. Rather than letting the leaders of Masada decide their fate, they made the decision for themselves. While the rest of the Sicarii are resisting ever having to bow to the Romans, these women resist the plans of their male kin. Their resistance is quieter. It involves hiding, remaining silent, and surviving. And for these women, when the choices seem to be either fighting the Romans, which could lead to enslavement or death by their kin, these women created a third option that left them in control as much as is possible in the midst of war, of their own fate. So now we'll return to our 2 rules. So when confronted with the option to die at the hands of their kin as a kind of oppression, these women chose to make their own path. Had they chosen to stand up to the men of the Sicarii who were committed to the act to not become subjects to Rome, they likely still would have been killed. Had they just submitted and not fought, they would have been killed. Instead, these women chose their own path, and in what I think was an attempt to save lives, also took some children with them to hide while the murder-suicide was taking place. It was only when the Romans arrived, but not ready to fight, that the women revealed themselves and the situation. The women made the most of their positions at Masada. With no good choices, they were able to maintain their own agency and create a third option. Second, these women, I think, chose life over death. We don't know if the Romans enslaved them. We don't hear about them after they share the story of what happened. We do know that they chose to save not just themselves. They didn't just go run and hide. They took 5 children with them. This, to me, is a clear sign of their priority, of their resistance. They did not want to fight. They did not want to die, but they did not want other people to die either. They wanted to live and to promote life. So they saved themselves and the children in the only way they knew how. They hid. And by hiding, when the Romans finally did come, they were able to continue to live. So as we can see from these examples, resistance in first century Judea is just as complicated as resistance is today. On the Roman side of things, before the war, Queen Berenike used her position and power to try to persuade the Romans to depose of a corrupt leader who was causing unrest, while on the Judean side, she and her brother attempted to assuage the Jewish populace to keep them from rebelling. In the midst of the revolt, we decenter Josephus's opinion about them, and we find some of the zealots resisted expectations of gender identity while still continuing to fight against the Romans. The two women at Masada are able to hide and live, also saving some children. They resist the groupthink that leads to the mass murder-suicide, and also were able to avoid fighting against the Romans. While the details of their resistance is different from what we may choose to do today, fundamentally, I think the underlying concept is the same. We do what we can that is within our own power and ability. Sometimes that may mean taking on the system, as Berenike did, or making the choice to reject what feels like the only possible choice, as the women at Masada did. Or maybe it means leaning into what makes us unique, especially if it is our own identity which is at stake, and to embrace how we are different and capable and wonderful, as did our gender-bending zealots. These examples from antiquity really highlight just how ubiquitous resistance is, and they should give us, I hope, courage and hope that our actions, no matter how inconsequential they seem, can make all the difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheinfeld. This was super interesting in those three texts I haven't seen combined in the way you did, so I really appreciate that. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and we have 2 mics, so we can kind of circulate if you have a question that you would like to pose to Dr. Sheinfeld. Yes, good.
If you believe that Josephus was not reliable in his texts, then how do we know the motivation behind what he said was done was in actuality done?
Yeah, this is an excellent question that any student of history should always ask about sources. But the fact is, this is what we have. Right, and so there's multiple ways we can look at it. We can look at it just on the literary level, right? We can say, well, we don't know, which is true. We don't. We have to make the most of what we have. So we can just analyze it literarily. But these are also historical records that were kept, right? They were preserved, copied by people. Doesn't mean they're true. I don't love that word in religious studies. So does it mean they're fact? Right? So there's different approaches, right? And this is where using different kinds of interpretive lenses helps us really get at the text, right? Can we ever really know? No, unless some other sources magically appear, which has happened before, right? Like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it has happened, but it's unlikely. But if we analyze kind of a standard historical critical, if you go to grad school in biblical studies, this is like the first thing they teach you if you don't learn it as an undergrad already in college. And then if you start applying other lenses, we think about, I use kind of a lens, feminist lens, for instance, queer lens. Right? There's different ways that you can read the text and look at it. And so what that really does is it kind of like, it's like, an onion. Like it peels back layers of the text, things that you don't always see that are there. Right? So is my interpretation true? What is that word doing exactly, right? But is it fact? I don't know, right? But we just looked at that. So is Josephus telling us the full truth about Masada? Probably not, but some of it's fact. Like we have other evidence and other sources. Yeah. So we have inscriptions from Berenike, Right. So there are some things that we can, again, we're really peeling back these layers and trying to use what we have to the best of our ability. And when something new comes available, then guess what? We have a party and reassess. Thank you.
How does an understanding of first century Judea explain to us what's happening in 21st century America?
Well, I'm an expert in one of those things and not the other. But I do think that, and really I think that's what I was trying to get at here, was that I see patterns of what's happening here that I find in our ancient sources as well. Does it help us solve the problem? Maybe not. But I do think that if we're students of history and we can see this, then we know what to expect, right? Whether it's first century Judea or 20th century Germany, or, right? We know what to expect, and so we can work against that. We can think about how can we decide, what can we do, right? What can we do to stop that or to change it, right? And what's within our power to do that? Great question.
What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Masada episode and resistance because, and I mean speaking only for myself anecdotally, Masada is so intricately tied up with the theme of resistance. But the people who are resisting, I think in the sort of popular imagination, are those who kill themselves, right? And that becomes the glorified act of resistance in the sort of legend of Masada, not the two women and the children that they hid. So could you speak a little bit more about the kind of reception history of the Masada story and of, in particular, the women who you highlighted? Yeah,
I don't think there's much reception history of the women, as far as I know. But I do know that Masada has played strongly and really in the front of the development of the state of Israel, and was initially used as kind of this representation: we will never give in, we will never be defeated, we will always fight, we will always, right? This level of kind of resisting. And in the past, I actually don't know, again, this is not my time period, so I'm guessing as to around 20 years, 30 years, something like that. There's been a lot of pushback in Israeli culture about using Masada in that way, because after all, they did, in fact, murder their relatives and kill themselves. And that perhaps this is not the best representation that we want as kind of defining who we are as a nation. And this is from, I didn't prepare well enough to remember the scholar. This is not my work, but I'm happy to send you the article that talks about this if you want. I can't remember her name, but yeah. Thanks.
I just wanted to say thank you for this. It was absolutely amazing. For the last few weeks, those of us in the doctoral program here have been talking a lot about agency. So I was curious to know who are some of the people who have informed your view on that? And I'm also curious to know how you see agency and resistance being together, or do they always need to be bound?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Are you asking about scholars who have informed my thought on this? So my co-authors, I always feel silly saying this because they're also my friends, but Meredith Warren and Sarah Parks, who, if you saw the book, their names are on there, my co-authors, honestly are the people I talk to, the scholars I talk to the most, and the ones who challenge me. So our fields overlap, but they're not the same. And so we are able to talk and share, but also we do different work. And so in a lot of ways, I know that probably wasn't the answer you're looking for, but in a lot of ways they challenge me the most. and challenge my thinking. But I don't know if other scholars that inform. Sarah Ahmed is like I'm her cheerleader, fangirl, right? Of Sarah Ahmed for sure. I listed some others actually in the talk. So thinking about like Bernadette Bruton and the work she's done on women and queer folks in antiquity has just been amazing. Again, really kind of not necessarily directly about agency, but thinking about how do we like decentering, kind of lifting up those voices that our ancient writers were not really interested in, right? So how do we find that? How do we hear them? And what do we do to make that happen? So those are some scholars just off the top of my head. And I already forgot your second question, and I'm sorry.
Do agency and resistance always have to be connected?
Oh, yeah, excellent question. I don't know the answer to that. What do you all think? Do they always have to be connected? Somebody just said no, and I saw somebody nodding their head. So I think we'll have to wait and see, I guess. Yeah. What do you think?
I would say I've been thinking a lot about this, especially in terms of like my family history and history of being enslaved in South Carolina. And I think, like the women in the Masada story, agency can be survival.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think we see stories of that as well in the Holocaust, like from my own background as well, right? Sometimes just living is the greatest act of resistance. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question a bit out of ignorance. If I remember right, and it's been quite a while since I've read about the Jewish War, that Josephus actually wrote it originally in his Aramaic tongue, and it was translated. Therefore, there were two versions of his story of the war. Just out of curiosity, is that true, first of all? And then second, did you look at both versions? I know the first one is allegedly lost, but I am very curious.
I did not look at the lost version. Yes. So that's what the historical records suggest, that he wrote first of the Jewish war, first in Aramaic. And I guess his Greek wasn't great. And so he had a lot of enslaved people working for him, helping him with translation into Greek. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. One of the questions that's coming to mind from a number of directions, so I'll try to boil it down, is this issue of representation, right? And as you said at the beginning, some of these stories just aren't even noticed, or they're noticed, but they're not noticed as resistance. And also there's this part of me, owing to my gray hair, I think, that just hears that the zealot story and says, well, that's not about gender, that's just a bunch of guys acting out, right? But now we have these tools and these ways of seeing, and we say, oh, wait a minute, those guys acting out are doing all this gender stuff, and it might plug into the author's ideas about gender stuff. So with all that as background, we start seeing things, in other words. It may not be representing the exact facts, but it's representing something about the time and place. So with that in mind, I'm so curious, how many others of these representations do you think are sitting there? And I don't even know where I mean there is. Maybe I mean in the Jewish War, or maybe in Josephus' Corpus, or some other place where you want to say, if we looked in this scope, we would find hundreds of others. Or do you feel like you've got the only 3 and you really need some more to help out?
That's also a good question. I don't know. I've said that twice now tonight. So to me, this isn't an excuse, I promise, but it's a sign of a good educator is to be able to say when you don't know something. But I don't know. But I do think it's worthwhile to keep looking. When I started this project, I knew of the 2, the first and the last. And I was looking, right, reading scholars, reading Josephus, like I'm like looking all over the place, trying to find them. And I remembered an article, actually in one of my edited volumes on the Zealots and the war. And I was like, I wonder if this has anything. And it was actually on this exact passage. And she referenced one other source. And so I read that as well, and I'm like, is this about gender? Right. I went through all of this too, and I think I told you at the beginning of before the talk started, that section on the Zealots, this is brand new. I've never presented that or shared that anywhere yet, so you all get that brand new. But as I started to look, I saw, people are saying, oh, nobody really talks about this. And then I find a reference to Tacitus, right, this Roman historian who's talking about women, right? And then, so it just, I don't know. I suspect there are others, right? It is hard, though, because Josephus was not terribly interested in women. And so will we find them? Probably. How many? Probably not too many. I hope we find a lot. Thank you.
So my question is about Josephus. And if you saw a change in tone at all, I know his first version was in Aramaic and the second was in Greek, but you touched upon the censorship by the Roman authorities, and I'm wondering how that plays into this account of the Zealot account that you portrayed up there. And if you picked up any nuances of changed literary tone, anything, color.
Yeah, thank you. So we don't know if Rome censored him or not. We do know that he had to write whatever he wrote had to be acceptable to whoever was reading it. And so while I think he could have a little bit of shade against Rome, most of it was not too bad, right? So it's complicated. But most of it was not too bad. We also know that Josephus used different sources. For Jewish War, he used fewer sources than for some of his other writings, because he experienced, or he claims to have experienced, a lot of it. He claims to have had access to like Roman general, like army reports and things like that. Did he? I don't know. We don't have those, but he claims to have had access to these sources. And so with the Zealots, we like that he's pretty consistently hating on them throughout the whole thing. So he really, really doesn't like them. But again, like what they were, like the other Jews that they were killing were like people like him, right? And so it's not surprising that he probably didn't like them that much. Thank you for your question.
Anybody else have a burning question? All right, let's thank Dr. Sheinfeld one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. We're so glad to have so many interested people come to the Kirk lecture this year. Thank you.